Sometimes life strips away everything you thought was permanent, leaving you standing at the crossroads of desperation and hope. That's where Miriam found herself, a widow who lost her husband, her home, and her future, all in one devastating year. She walks into a quiet Amish town with nothing but worn clothes and memories. The families are kind, offering meals and work, but everyone knows charity has limits. Then Samuel Beiler, a farmer who's been alone for 3 years, stands before the whole community and says something shocking. "You need a home, and I need sons." His bold words send whispers through every household. What starts as a practical arrangement soon becomes something much deeper. But what happens when two broken hearts begin to heal together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn gold band on Miriam's finger caught the late afternoon sun as she shifted the small canvas bag from one shoulder to the other. 3 months ago, that ring had symbolized 18 years of marriage to David, a gentle man who taught mathematics at the local high school. 3 months ago, she'd had a modest 2-bedroom house with yellow curtains in the kitchen and a vegetable garden that produced more tomatoes than they could eat. 3 months ago, she'd been Mrs. Miriam Walsh, respected member of the community, substitute teacher, and wife to a man who made her laugh every morning over coffee. Now the ring felt heavy against her skin, a reminder of everything that cancer had stolen in the span of 6 brutal months. The winding road through Pennsylvania's countryside had led her here by accident, or perhaps by providence, as her grandmother might have said. She'd been driving aimlessly after the bank foreclosed on the house, her car finally giving up 20 miles outside Lancaster County. The mechanic in town had delivered the news with genuine sympathy. The transmission was gone, and fixing it would cost more than the vehicle was worth. He'd offered her $50 for scrap, which she'd taken along with directions to the nearest bus station. But something about the rolling green hills and the clip-clop of horse hooves on asphalt had made her pause. She'd walked instead of taking the bus, drawn by the peace that seemed to emanate from every carefully tended farm and simple white farmhouse. The Amish country felt like stepping back in time, away from the harsh realities of medical bills and legal notices and the pitying looks of former neighbors. The first family she'd encountered had been the Yoders, working in their roadside produce stand. Martha Yoder, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair tucked beneath a white prayer covering, had taken one look at Miriam's dusty clothes and weary expression and insisted she sit down for a glass of cold lemonade. The conversation had been gentle, probing without being intrusive. When Miriam admitted she had nowhere particular to go, Martha had exchanged meaningful glances with her husband Eli before inviting her to stay for supper. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Miriam had been passed from family to family like a cherished but temporary guest. She'd helped Martha can peaches, assisted Mary Stoltzfus with her autumn quilting, and spent long days in the fields with the fisher women, learning to appreciate the rhythm of work that followed the sun's path across the sky. Each family fed her well, treated her with kindness, and made space for her in their simple homes. But she wasn't family, she wasn't Amish, she was English, as they gently termed outsiders. And while their Christian charity was genuine and generous, everyone understood it had natural boundaries. Samuel Beiler had been different from the start. She'd first noticed him at the Yoder farm, delivering milk in the early morning hours. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades working the soil. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his beard, neatly trimmed in the Amish fashion, framed a face that might have been carved from the same sturdy oak that grew in his woodlots. But it was his eyes that had caught her attention, deep brown, thoughtful, carrying a weight she recognized. He was a man who understood loss. Their first conversation had been brief. He'd nodded politely when Martha introduced them, his gaze taking in her obvious status as an outsider without judgment. "You're the teacher," he'd said simply, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked the Pennsylvania Dutch community. "I was a teacher," she'd corrected, surprised that news of her background had traveled. "Knowledge doesn't disappear because—" "Circumstances change," he'd replied, loading empty milk cans onto his wagon with easy efficiency. "A person remains what they are, no matter where they find themselves." The comment had stayed with her through the long days that followed. In quiet moments, she found herself thinking about Samuel Beiler and the way he'd looked at her, not with pity or curiosity, but with understanding. She'd learned his story in pieces, through careful conversations with the women who welcomed her into their kitchens. Samuel had been married to Rebecca Zook, a sweet girl known throughout the community for her gentle nature and skill with healing herbs. They'd been married 7 years when Rebecca became pregnant with their first child. The entire settlement had rejoiced, knowing how desperately the couple longed for children. Rebecca had died in childbirth, along with the son they'd planned to name after Samuel's father. That had been 3 years ago, and Samuel had retreated into his work and his grief. He maintained his farm with the same careful attention as always, participated in community barn raisings and harvest celebrations, and fulfilled his duties as a baptized member of the church. But he'd remained alone, declining the gentle suggestions of matchmaking that widowed men in the community typically received. He built that cradle with his own hands, Martha had confided one evening as they shelled peas on the front porch. Carved every spindle, sanded it smooth as silk. It's up in his attic now, never been used. Some say he should give it away, let another family benefit from such fine craftsmanship. But a man's grief takes its own time. Miriam had understood. Her own grief had sharp edges that caught her at unexpected moments. The sight of David's favorite coffee mug in a store window, the sound of a specific song on someone's radio, the smell of the cologne he'd worn for special occasions. Grief was personal, stubborn, and it demanded its own timeline. The Amish settlement of Cedar Valley comprised about 40 families scattered across the rolling farmland. At its heart sat the one-room schoolhouse where Amish children learned their lessons in Pennsylvania Dutch, German, and English. Next to it stood the large white barn that served for church services, rotating between families according to ancient custom. There was no pastor in the traditional sense. The bishop, ministers, and deacon were chosen by lot from among the men, and they led services with quiet authority. Bishop Jonas Lapp was a man in his 60s whose white beard reached nearly to his chest. He'd been kind to Miriam, allowing her to attend services and even inviting her to speak with the children about life outside their community. But she'd seen the questions in his eyes, the careful way he measured his words when she was present. He was a man responsible for maintaining order and tradition, and her presence represented a gentle disruption to both. The settlement's rhythm was dictated by sunrise and sunset, by seasons and weather, by the needs of animals and crops and community. Miriam had fallen into that rhythm more easily than she'd expected, rising before dawn to help with milking, spending long hours in kitchens where women worked side by side, preparing meals for large families, joining the evening gatherings where stories were shared and children played simple games before bedtime. All of it had brought a peace she hadn't felt since David's diagnosis. But peace wasn't permanence, and she'd begun to feel the subtle signs that her welcome, while genuine, was reaching its natural conclusion. Conversations quieted when she entered. Rooms, glances were exchanged between husbands and wives. The question of her future hung unspoken, but present in every interaction. She'd been staying with the Fisher family for 4 days, when Samuel appeared at their door just after the evening meal. Miriam had been in the kitchen, helping young Mary Fisher with the dishes, when she heard his voice in the front room speaking quietly with Aaron Fisher. The conversation was brief, conducted in Pennsylvania Dutch, but she caught her name mentioned several times. When Aaron called her to join them, she found Samuel standing with his hat in his hands, his expression serious but not unkind. "I'd like to speak with you," he said simply. "If you're agreeable, we could walk for a bit. There's something I want to discuss." The October evening was crisp but not cold, and the sky above the rolling hills had deepened to the color of old pewter. They walked in comfortable silence along the dirt road that connected the Fisher farm to Samuel's property, their footsteps soft on the packed earth. In the distance, a barn owl called from the maple grove, and somewhere a cow lowed softly as evening chores continued. "You've been with us nearly a month," Samuel said finally, his voice thoughtful. "Yes." She waited, sensing he was building towards something important. "The families speak well of you. You work hard, you're respectful of our ways, and you've been kind to the children." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But you're not family, you're not Amish, and winter is coming." The words weren't cruel, but they held truth that couldn't be avoided. She'd known this conversation was inevitable. "I understand," she said quietly. "I've been grateful for everyone's kindness, but I know I can't stay indefinitely." Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her. In the gathering dusk, his eyes were serious but not without warmth. "That's what I wanted to discuss," he said. "I have a proposition to make, though it may sound strange to English ears." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "I'm listening. My farm is productive, but it's meant for a family. I have a good house, fertile fields, and livestock that provide well. What I don't have is a wife to help manage the household, or children to carry on the work." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "You need a place to belong, a home that can't be taken away, and I need someone to share the responsibilities of building a family." Miriam felt her breath catch. "Samuel, are you—" "I'm proposing marriage," he said simply. "Not for romance or passion, but for practical reasons that would benefit us both. You'd have security, a permanent place in the community. I'd have a partner to help build the life I've wanted since Rebecca died." The directness of it left her speechless for a moment. In her world, her former world, such arrangements existed mainly in historical novels. But standing here on this quiet road, with the honest man who'd offered her the most precious gift imaginable, it made perfect sense. "What would people think?" she asked finally. "They'd think we were two adults making a sensible decision," Samuel replied. "There would be talk, certainly. Some would disapprove. But the bishop would marry us if we both expressed genuine intent, and the community would accept it in time." Miriam looked out across the fields that would soon be his, and possibly hers. The practical part of her mind catalogued the benefits: security, belonging, purpose. The part of her that still grieved David whispered that this wasn't love, wasn't what marriage should be. But perhaps, she thought, love took different forms at different seasons of life. "I'd need time to consider," she said. Samuel nodded, settling, his hat back on his head. "Take all the time you need." "But Miriam—" He paused, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression softened. "I think we could build something good together, something that would honor both our losses and create hope for the future." As they walked back toward the Fisher farm in thoughtful silence, Miriam found herself imagining a different kind of life than any she'd previously considered. It wouldn't be the passionate romance of her youth or the comfortable companionship she'd known with David. It would be something entirely new, a partnership built on mutual need, respect, and perhaps in time, a deeper affection. The worn wedding ring on her finger felt lighter somehow, as if David's memory had given her permission to consider a future she'd never imagined possible. The bronze bell that hung from the oak tree beside the schoolhouse had called Cedar Valley's families together for over 50 years. Its voice carried across the farms on quiet Sunday evenings, summoning the community for matters too important for casual conversation. Decisions about shared resources, discussions of church discipline, or announcements that affected everyone's daily lives. Miriam had heard its deep, resonant tone 3 times during her stay, but she'd never attended one of the gatherings. They were for family members, for those whose roots ran deep in the settlement soil, Tonight, however, Martha Yoder had gently suggested she come along. Samuel asked specifically that you be there, Martha had said, adjusting her black shawl, against the evening chill. Whatever he has to say, it concerns you directly. The schoolhouse could hold perhaps 60 people when necessary, with the men gathered on one side and the women on the other, children quiet on benches in the back. Tonight, it seemed every family in Cedar Valley had answered the bell's call. Oil lanterns cast warm pools of light across the simple wooden interior, and the soft murmur of Pennsylvania Dutch mixed with English as neighbors greeted each other. Bishop Lapp stood at the front of the room, his weathered hands folded calmly over his Bible. His presence commanded respect without demanding it, the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of guiding a community through both joy and hardship. When he raised one hand slightly, the conversations faded to expectant silence. We gather tonight because Samuel Beiler has requested time to speak to the community about a matter of importance, the bishop said, his accented English clear and measured. As is our custom, we will listen with open hearts and minds and offer our counsel as the Spirit leads. Samuel rose from his seat among the men, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore his best dark suit, the one reserved for church, services and solemn occasions, and his beard was neatly trimmed. But Miriam could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his calloused hands held steady at his sides through sheer will. "Friends and neighbors," Samuel began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "You know me as a man who chooses his words carefully, who doesn't speak unless he has something worth saying. Tonight, I have something worth saying." A few heads nodded encouragingly. Samuel had been part of this community his entire life, born in the settlement, baptized in its faith, and known for his steady character and strong work ethic. Whatever he wanted to discuss, it would be received with respect. "For 3 years I've lived alone on my farm," Samuel continued. "You've all been patient with my grief, understanding of my need for solitude. You've helped with harvest when my hands weren't enough, shared your tables when my own seemed too empty, and never pushed me toward decisions I wasn't ready to make." Miriam felt her heart racing. She could sense where this was leading, but hearing it announced to the entire community felt surreal and terrifying. But a farm is meant to be worked by a family, and a house is meant to shelter more than one person, Samuel said. "I've been thinking and praying about this for weeks now, and I believe God has placed an opportunity before us, all of us, that serves both practical need and Christian charity." Bishop Lapp leaned forward slightly, his expression attentive, but unreadable. "As you know, we have among us a woman who finds herself without family or home through no fault of her own," Samuel continued, his gaze finding Miriam briefly before returning to the broader group. "Miriam Walsh has proven herself to be of good character, willing to work, respectful of our ways. She's educated, skilled with children, and has been a blessing to every family that has welcomed her." Murmurs rippled through the room, not disapproving, but interested, curious about where Samuel's words were leading. "I've spoken with her privately about this, and tonight I want to speak to all of you." Samuel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I'm proposing to take Miriam as my wife, and I'm asking for the community's blessing on our union." The silence that followed was profound. Miriam could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel dozens of pairs of eyes turning toward her. Some faces showed surprise, others thoughtfulness, a few clear disapproval, but most displayed the careful consideration that characterized this community's approach to important decisions. Elder Aaron Stoltzfus, a man whose opinions carried significant weight, was the first to speak. "Samuel, are you certain this decision comes from wisdom rather than loneliness? Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered lightly." "I'm certain, Aaron," Samuel replied without hesitation. "This isn't about loneliness driving me to hasty action. It's about recognizing an opportunity for mutual benefit that could honor God and serve our community well." "But she's English," called out John King, a younger man with 3 small children. She hasn't been baptized into our faith, doesn't understand our ways fully. She's been living among us for nearly a month, Samuel responded calmly. She's shown respect for our customs, willingness to learn, and natural understanding of our values. As for baptism, that's a decision she would need to make for herself in time. Bishop Lapp raised his hand gently, quieting the building discussion. Samuel, help us understand your reasoning. This is an unusual situation, and the community deserves to hear your heart on this matter. Samuel nodded, his expression growing, more solemn. My reasoning is this. I have a farm that needs the hands and heart of a family. I have a house meant for children and the sound of daily life. I have skills and resources to provide security for a woman who has lost everything through tragedy. He paused, his voice softening slightly. And Miriam has gifts that could bless our community. Her education, her experience with children, her gentle spirit that we've all witnessed these past weeks. What of love? Asked Mary Yoder, Martha's daughter-in-law, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than criticism. Marriage without love is like planting without hope of harvest. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Miriam could see him, choosing his words with care. Love takes many forms, he said finally. There's the passionate love of youth, the comfortable love of long companionship, and the practical love that grows from shared purpose and mutual respect. Rebecca and I had the first kind, a blessing I'm grateful for, but I'm older now, and perhaps what I need is something different, something built on understanding rather than romance. An elderly woman named Sarah Lapp, the bishop's wife, spoke from the women's side of the room. And what does Miriam say about this proposal? A woman should speak for herself in such matters. All eyes turned to Miriam, and she felt her mouth go dry. She'd known this moment would come, but facing the entire community felt overwhelming. These people had shown her extraordinary kindness, but they were also protective of their traditions and careful about outsiders. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady. I'm grateful to Samuel for his offer, she began, her voice barely above a whisper before growing stronger. I won't pretend that my situation isn't desperate. I have nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no means of supporting myself. But I also won't accept charity disguised as marriage unless I truly believe I can contribute something of value in return. She took a breath, feeling the weight of their attention, but drawing strength from their genuine interest in her answer. I've learned much about your community these past weeks, she continued. I've seen the way you care for each other, the way work is shared and burdens are lightened through cooperation. I've watched children grow up surrounded by adults who all take responsibility for their welfare. If Samuel truly believes I could be part of building that kind of life, then yes, I would be honored to accept his proposal. The silence stretched for several seconds before Bishop Lapp spoke. This is indeed an unusual situation, he said thoughtfully. We would need time for prayer and consideration. There would be requirements, instruction in our faith, understanding of our expectations for married life, commitment to raising children in our ways. I understand, Miriam replied. I wouldn't expect to be accepted without proving my commitment. There will be talk, added Aaron Stoltzfus, his tone matter-of-fact, rather than disapproving, from our own people, and certainly from the English neighbors. Are you both prepared for that? Samuel nodded firmly. Let them talk. We know our own hearts and minds. Bishop Lapp looked around the room, gauging the community's mood. I propose we adjourn for tonight and allow everyone time to consider this matter prayerfully. We'll gather again in 1 week to discuss any concerns and, if the community is agreeable, to begin the process of preparation for marriage. As the meeting broke up, Miriam found herself surrounded by small groups of women offering quiet words of support or gentle questions about her intentions. The men clustered around Samuel, their conversations conducted in low tones and Pennsylvania Dutch. but she caught enough English to understand that while there was concern about the unconventional nature of the arrangement, there was also respect for Samuel's character and recognition of the practical wisdom in his proposal. Walking home through the crisp October night, Miriam realized that Samuel Beiler had just changed both of their lives in ways neither could fully predict. The worn wedding ring on her finger seemed to pulse with the memory of one kind of love, while her heart began to imagine what an entirely different kind of partnership might offer. The community's bronze bell was silent now, but its message had been delivered. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new challenges, and the beginning of a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about love, faith, and the courage required to build a life from the ashes of loss. The teaching certificate was yellowed at the edges and bore the official seal of the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Miriam Marie Walsh. Certified to teach elementary education, valid through June 2025. She'd found it tucked between the pages of her Bible, one of the few possessions she'd managed to save before the foreclosure. Now it lay on the small table beside her bed in the bishop's house, where she'd been staying since the community meeting 3 days ago. Martha Lapp, the bishop's wife, had insisted on the arrangement. "It's proper," she'd said with gentle firmness, "for a woman considering marriage to stay with the bishop's family during the preparation time. We'll help you understand what will be expected, and you'll have guidance if questions arise." The questions had been endless, though asked with kindness. How did she feel about giving up electricity permanently? Could she learn to cook on a wood stove? Did she understand the commitment involved in raising children in the Amish faith? Was she prepared for the physical demands of farm life? Some questions she could answer with confidence. Yes, she could learn new ways of cooking and managing a household. Yes, she wanted children and would be honored to raise them in a community that valued family so deeply. Others left her uncertain. Could she truly embrace a faith that demanded such separation from the modern world? Would she find fulfillment in a life so different from everything she'd known? This morning, she'd been assigned to help Anna Stoltzfus with the settlement's one-room school. Anna, an unmarried woman in her 30s who served as the community's teacher, had welcomed Miriam with cautious optimism. "Samuel mentioned you were a teacher in your former life," Anna said, as they prepared. "Lessons for the day. The children could benefit from your experience, especially with English. Many of them struggle with writing and reading comprehension beyond basic levels." The schoolhouse was simple but well organized, with wooden desks arranged in neat rows, and a blackboard that showed the careful handwriting of someone who took education seriously. Children ranged in age from 6 to 14, the older ones helping the younger with their lessons in the traditional Amish way. Miriam found herself naturally falling into teaching rhythms she'd thought were lost forever. She worked with the youngest children on their alphabet, helped middle schoolers with arithmetic problems, and assisted the older students with an English composition assignment. Their eager faces and willingness to learn reminded her of why she'd chosen teaching in the first place. "You have a gift with them," Anna observed during the afternoon break, watching as Miriam helped 8-year-old Katie Yoder sound out difficult words. "They respond to your patience." "I've missed this," Miriam admitted, surprised by how true the words felt. "I didn't realize how much I'd missed working with children until now." That evening, as she helped Martha prepare supper for the bishop's family, the conversation turned to the practical realities of her potential marriage to Samuel. "He's a good man," Martha said, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency, "but he carries his grief heavily. Rebecca's death changed him in ways that even time hasn't healed." "What was she like?" Miriam asked, genuinely curious about the woman who had held Samuel's heart. Martha's expression softened, sweet as summer honey, and gentle with everyone she met. She had a gift for healing, knew which herbs to use for different ailments, could coax a fever down with just her touch and prayers. The whole community mourned when we lost her. It must be difficult for Samuel considering marriage again. That's what worries some people, Martha said quietly. They wonder if he's trying to replace Rebecca, or if he's capable of opening his heart to someone new. A marriage without the possibility of love is like a garden without sun. It might survive, but it won't truly flourish. That night, Miriam lay awake thinking about Martha's words. She'd agreed to this arrangement because it offered security and belonging, but she hadn't fully considered what it might mean for Samuel. Was he seeking a companion or simply a solution to loneliness? Could she be content in a marriage where she might always live in another woman's shadow? The next morning brought her first real test of community acceptance. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the bishop's house when 3 of the settlement's women approached: Sarah King, Ruth Fisher, and Mary Stoltzfus. Their expressions were serious but not unfriendly. "We've been talking," Sarah began without a preamble, "about Samuel's proposal and what it means for all of us." Miriam set down the wet sheet she'd been holding and gave them her full attention. "I appreciate your directness. We're not opposed to the marriage," Ruth said carefully, "but we have concerns. You're English, unfamiliar with our ways. Samuel is a respected member of our community, and any woman he marries becomes part of our extended family." "What would you like to know?" Miriam asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mary Stoltzfus stepped forward, her expression kind but searching. "Can you truly commit to our way of life? Not just the visible things, the plain dress, the simple living, but the deeper commitment to putting community needs before individual desires, to raising children who will choose to remain Amish rather than seeking the outside world." The question cut to the heart of her uncertainties. "I can't promise that adaptation will be easy," Miriam said honestly, "but I've lived among you for over a month now, and I've seen the value in your way of life, the sense of purpose, the way everyone cares for each other. It's something I lost when my husband died, something I didn't realize I was desperate to find again." "And if Samuel never learns to love you the way he loved Rebecca," Sarah asked bluntly, "if this marriage remains purely practical?" Miriam was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "I've had love in my life. Deep, passionate, all-consuming love with my first husband. Losing that taught me that love isn't the only foundation for a meaningful partnership. Respect, shared purpose, mutual care, those things matter too. If that's what Samuel and I can build together, I think it could be enough." The 3 women exchanged glances, and Miriam could see them weighing her words against their own experiences and expectations. "There's something else," Ruth said finally. "Samuel hasn't been the same since Rebecca died. He's withdrawn, careful with his emotions. Some of us worry that he's choosing this marriage to avoid the risk of truly loving again." "Then perhaps," Miriam said quietly, "we're both choosing it to avoid risks we're not ready to face. Maybe that's not such a terrible foundation to start with." Sarah smiled for the first time since their conversation began. "You're wiser than we gave you credit for," she said. "A practical marriage between 2 people who understand loss might have better chances than a passionate one between people who've never been tested." As the women walked away, Miriam felt a small knot of tension release in her chest. She was beginning to understand that acceptance in this community would come slowly, through proved actions rather than spoken promises. But she was also beginning to believe that she might actually find a place here, not just as Samuel's wife, but as a valued member of a family that extended far beyond blood relations. That afternoon, Samuel appeared at the bishop's house for the first time since the community meeting. He spoke briefly with Bishop Lapp before asking if he could walk with Miriam around the property. "How are you finding your stay here?" he asked as they strolled past the vegetable garden where late autumn crops were still producing. "Everyone's been kind," she replied, then added more honestly, "and thorough in their questions about my commitment." Samuel smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "They're protective of their own, and you're asking to become part of something they've spent generations building. Questions are natural. Do you have questions too?" He was quiet for several steps before answering. "Every day. But not about your character or your willingness to learn our ways. You've proven both of those already. What then? Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but not unkind. I question whether I'm being fair to you, asking you to accept a marriage that might never become more than a partnership of convenience. You're young enough to find love again, to have the kind of marriage every woman deserves. Miriam looked into his troubled eyes and saw the weight of guilt he carried, not just over Rebecca's death, but over his inability to offer her the complete emotional commitment their arrangement might eventually demand. Samuel, she said gently, I'm not a young woman seeking her first love. I'm a middle-aged widow who's learned that life rarely gives us everything we want, but sometimes it offers us exactly what we need. If you can offer me a home, partnership in meaningful work, and the possibility of children to love, that might be more than enough. Something in his expression softened, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been before grief taught him to guard his heart so carefully. Then we understand each other, he said quietly, and perhaps that's the best foundation we could hope for. The unfinished quilt lay folded in the cedar chest at the foot of Samuel's bed, its pattern half complete in shades of deep blue and cream. Rebecca had been working on it during the long winter evenings before her pregnancy, planning to finish it in time for their baby's arrival. The careful stitches spoke of hope and anticipation, a future that had been cut short by tragedy. Samuel hadn't looked at the quilt in over a year, but tonight, with marriage to Miriam only 2 weeks away, he found himself drawn to the chest like a man compelled to face his ghosts. The pattern was wedding ring, traditional and complex, requiring patience and skill to execute properly. Rebecca had chosen it specifically for their future children, imagining generations of babies wrapped in its warmth. Now it represented everything he'd lost, everything he'd been afraid to hope for again. A knock at his kitchen door interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he could see Miriam standing on his porch, a covered basket in her hands. She wore the simple, dark dress that had been made for her during her stay with the bishop's family, her hair covered by a white prayer cap that marked her growing acceptance into the community. Martha sent soup, she said when he opened the door, her breath visible in the cold November air. She thought you might be too busy with farm work to cook properly. It was a gentle lie, and they both knew it. Martha had sent Miriam as much to check on his state of mind as to deliver food. The kindness behind the deception touched him more than he cared to admit. Come in, he said, stepping aside to let her enter. The kitchen's warm, his house reflected. The careful attention of a man who took pride in his surroundings but lived alone. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was an emptiness to it. No flowers on the windowsill, no feminine touches that made a house feel like a home. Miriam set the basket on his wooden table and began unpacking soup, fresh bread, and apple butter. You don't need to wait on me, Samuel said, watching as she moved efficiently around his kitchen, finding bowls and spoons without asking where they were kept. I'm not waiting on you, she replied with a small smile. I'm learning my way around. The kitchen I'll be working in soon, there's a difference. The practical nature of her response pleased him. She wasn't trying to play at being his wife already, but she was taking steps to understand the reality of their upcoming partnership. They ate in comfortable silence, the soup warming them against the evening chill. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and carried the scent of coming snow. Winter would be here soon, bringing long nights and the kind of weather that kept families gathered close around wood stoves, sharing stories and planning for spring. Tell me about your expectations, Miriam said eventually, setting down her spoon and regarding him seriously. Not the community's expectations, or what the bishop thinks is proper. Your expectations for our marriage. The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most women he'd known approached such topics carefully, obliquely, but Miriam had learned that directness often served better than dancing around difficult subjects. I expect honesty, he said after a moment's consideration. partnership in the work that keeps this farm running, respect for the faith and traditions that guide our community. He paused, then added more quietly, and patience as we both learn what this marriage will become. What about children? I want children, he said simply. It's one of the main reasons I proposed this arrangement. But I understand that may take time, both physically and emotionally. Miriam nodded, her expression thoughtful. I want children too. I always imagined having a large family with David, but that wasn't to be. This feels like a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever. And what are your expectations? Samuel asked, turning the question back to her. Honesty, as you said, kindness even when we disagree or struggle to understand each other, and room to grow into this life. I don't expect to master everything immediately. She hesitated, then continued, I also hope for friendship. I think we could be good friends, Samuel, if we allow ourselves to be. Friendship. The word settled between them with surprising weight. Samuel realized he hadn't had a true friend since Rebecca's death. People who cared about him, certainly, but no one with whom he could share his deeper thoughts and concerns. I'd like that, he said quietly. After Miriam left, Samuel found himself returning to the cedar chest and the unfinished quilt, but instead of pain, he felt something closer to possibility. Perhaps it was time to finish what Rebecca had started, not as a monument to the past, but as a bridge to the future. The next morning brought their first real test as a soon-to-be-married couple. Samuel had asked Miriam to help him prepare his house for her arrival after the wedding, and she'd agreed readily, but when she arrived at dawn, she found him standing in his bedroom, staring at the cedar chest, with an expression of profound uncertainty. I don't know what to do with her things, he admitted without preamble. I've left everything exactly as it was when she died. Her clothes in the wardrobe, her sewing basket beside the chair, even her hairbrush still on the dresser. Miriam looked around the room and understood immediately. Rebecca's presence was everywhere, in the delicate embroidered pillowcases, the small blue bottles on the windowsill that had once held her medicinal herbs, the way everything was arranged with feminine care and attention to beauty. What feels right to you? She asked gently. I don't know, Samuel said, his voice tight with emotion. Packing it all away feels like erasing her, but leaving it feels unfair to you. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, thinking not just about the practical concerns, but about the man standing beside her, still torn between honoring his past and embracing his future. May I see the quilt? She asked finally. Samuel lifted the lid of the cedar chest and carefully removed the folded fabric. As he spread it across the bed, Miriam could see the intricate pattern taking shape, the careful stitches that spoke of countless quiet evenings spent in hopeful preparation. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers along the completed sections. She was skilled. She planned to finish it before the baby came, Samuel said quietly. Said every child should have something made with love to welcome them into the world. Miriam studied the pattern, mentally calculating how much work remained. The design was complex, but not beyond her abilities. She'd learned quilting from her own grandmother years ago. I'd like to finish it, she said suddenly, the words surprising herself as much as Samuel. Not to replace what she did, but to complete what she started. For the children we hope to have. Samuel stared at her, something shifting in his expression. You'd do that, if you'd like me to. It seems, she searched for the right words, like the right way to honor her memory while building our future. She wanted children to be wrapped in love. That doesn't have to end with her. In death, for the first time since she'd known him, Samuel's carefully controlled composure cracked. His eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for 3 years, and his voice was rough when he spoke. Rebecca would have liked you, he said simply. She would have been glad to know her work would be completed by someone who understood its meaning. They spent the rest of the morning carefully packing Rebecca's personal belongings, not hiding them away, but preserving them with the respect due to a beloved memory. Her sewing supplies went into a special box for Miriam to use. Her books were set aside for study. The small treasures that had brought her joy were wrapped carefully and stored where they could be remembered but wouldn't overshadow the new life taking shape. By afternoon, the bedroom looked ready for a new beginning, while still honoring the love that had first blessed it. And Samuel looked like a man who had finally found a way to move forward without leaving his heart behind. "We're going to be all right," Miriam said as they stood surveying their work. "Yes," Samuel replied, and for the first time he seemed to truly believe it. "I think we are." That evening, as Miriam walked back to the bishop's house through the gathering dusk, she carried with her a sense of rightness she hadn't felt since David's death. This wasn't the passionate romance of her youth, but it was something potentially deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared loss, and the kind of understanding that could only come from two people who had learned how precious and fragile happiness could be. The unfinished quilt would be completed, children would be born to fill the careful room Samuel had prepared, and two broken hearts would have the chance to heal together. Sometimes, Miriam thought, the most beautiful love stories weren't about finding perfection, but about finding the courage to build something new from the pieces of what had been lost. The marriage contract lay on Bishop Lapp's kitchen table, written in Samuel's careful script on plain white paper. It was a simple document, devoid of romantic language or flowery promises, outlining instead the practical commitments they were making to each other and to the community. "I, Samuel Beiler, take Miriam Walsh as my wife, promising before God and this community to provide for her material needs, to treat her with respect and kindness, and to work alongside her in building a Christian household that honors our Amish faith and traditions. I, Miriam Walsh, take Samuel Beiler as my husband, promising before God and this community to be a faithful partner in managing our household, to learn and follow the customs of the Amish faith, and to work alongside him in raising children who will be grounded in our beliefs and way of life." Below their stated commitments were practical details: how property would be managed, what would happen if either became unable to fulfill their duties due to illness or injury, and their mutual agreement that any children born to their union would be raised within the Amish community. Miriam read through the document slowly, aware that Bishop Lapp and his wife Martha were watching her carefully. In 2 days, she would stand before the entire community and make these promises legally and spiritually binding. The weight of that commitment felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. "It's quite different from English marriage ceremonies," Martha observed gently. "No grand celebration, no elaborate promises of romantic love, but more honest, perhaps," Miriam replied, setting down the paper. "We're being clear about what we're promising each other, without pretending this is something it's not." Bishop Lapp nodded approvingly. "Marriage is a sacred commitment, but it's also a practical partnership that affects the entire community. When two people join their lives, they're creating a new household that will contribute to our common good for generations." That afternoon, Miriam joined the women of the community for her final preparation, a gathering that was part instruction, part celebration, and part gentle interrogation. The ladies had assembled in Sarah King's spacious kitchen, bringing with them the wedding gifts that tradition demanded, practical items a new wife would need to establish her household. Anna Stoltzfus presented a set of hand-carved wooden spoons. Mary Yoder had made a dozen kitchen towels from soft linen. Ruth Fisher contributed a collection of glass canning jars, essential for preserving the abundant harvests that would feed a family through winter months. Each gift came with quiet advice about its use and the giver's hopes for Miriam's success in her new role. "Running an Amish household is different from what you're used to," explained Sarah King, spreading one of her own quilts across a chair to demonstrate proper care. "Everything we do serves multiple purposes: beauty, function, and economy all at once. Nothing is wasted, and everything has its proper season." The conversation turned to more intimate matters as the afternoon progressed. The older women speaking with the frankness that came from decades of marriage and motherhood, offered guidance about the physical aspects of marriage and childbearing. Their advice was practical rather than romantic, focused on health, comfort, and the patience required to build intimacy with a reserved man like Samuel. "He's been alone for 3 years, Martha Lapp said quietly. "Don't expect him to open his heart immediately. Samuel was deeply wounded by Rebecca's death, and healing takes time." "What if he never learns to love me?" Miriam asked, voicing the fear she'd been carrying since agreeing to the marriage. The women exchanged glances, and it was elderly Hannah Stoltzfus who answered, her voice gentle but firm. "Love isn't just a feeling, child. It's a choice made daily through action and commitment. If you and Samuel choose to treat each other with kindness, respect, and care, love will grow from that soil. Maybe not the passionate love of youth, but something deeper and more lasting." That evening, Samuel appeared at the bishop's house for their final private conversation before the wedding. They walked to the small grove behind the property, where bare oak trees stretched their branches against a sky filled with early stars. "Are you certain about this?" Samuel asked without preamble. "Tomorrow we'll make promises that can't be easily broken. If you have doubts—" "I have doubts," Miriam interrupted honestly, "about my ability to adapt, about whether I can truly become the kind of wife this community expects. But I don't doubt that this is the right choice for both of us." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. "I need you to understand something," he said finally. "I may never be able to give you the kind of love Rebecca and I shared. That part of my heart died with her." "I understand," Miriam replied, "and I may never stop grieving David, or wishing our life together could have been longer, but that doesn't mean we can't build something meaningful together. A partnership based on honesty rather than passion," Samuel mused. "Is that so terrible?" "No," he said, turning to look at her in the starlight. "I think it might be exactly what we both need." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the fields and a sharp wind that spoke of winter's approach. Miriam woke before sunrise in the bishop's house, her stomach tight with nerves and anticipation. Martha helped her dress in the new clothing that had been made for the occasion. A deep blue dress of simple cut, a white apron, and the black shoes that marked her as a married woman. Over her hair, she wore a white prayer covering that had been Rebecca's, a gift from Samuel that had surprised everyone with its symbolic generosity. "You look proper," Martha said, adjusting the covering's ties. "Every inch an Amish wife." The ceremony would take place in the Yoda barn, with the entire community in attendance. As Miriam walked across the frost-covered fields toward the gathering, she could see families arriving in their buggies, their dark clothing stark against the white-covered landscape. Samuel waited beside Bishop Lapp, wearing his best black suit and looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. When their eyes met across the assembled crowd, he offered a small smile that steadied her racing heart. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Bishop Lapp spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, the responsibilities of husband and wife, and the importance of building a household that would honor God and serve the community. Samuel and Miriam repeated their vows clearly, their voices carrying across the hushed barn. When Bishop Lapp pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, no dramatic moment of romantic culmination. Instead, Samuel took her hand in his, the first time they had touched with intentional intimacy, and squeezed it gently. The warmth of his calloused palm against hers felt like a promise of protection and partnership. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. Tables groaned under the weight of traditional foods prepared by the community women. Children ran between the adults, their laughter bright in the cold air. The men discussed farming and weather, while the women offered Miriam practical advice and genuine welcome. As the sun set and families began preparing to leave, Miriam realized that she was no longer a guest or a temporary resident. She was Samuel's wife, a member of this community with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. The knowledge was both thrilling and sobering. "Ready to go home?" Samuel asked as they stood beside his waiting buggy. "Home," The word carried new weight, new meaning. Not the house she'd shared with David, not the temporary shelter she'd found with various families, but the place where she would build a life with this quiet, thoughtful man who had offered her a future when she'd thought she had none. "Yes," she said, climbing into the buggy beside her new husband. "I'm ready." Samuel's father's Bible sat on the kitchen table between them, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of handling. The pages fell open naturally to Proverbs, where verses about marriage and family life had been underlined in fading ink by Samuel's grandfather decades earlier. It was their third morning as husband and wife, and they had fallen into a careful rhythm that felt both foreign and oddly natural. Samuel rose before dawn to tend the livestock, while Miriam prepared breakfast on the wood-burning stove she was still learning to manage. They ate together in comfortable silence, discussing the day's work before Samuel headed to the fields, and Miriam tackled the endless tasks of maintaining an Amish household. "Read to me," Samuel said unexpectedly, pushing the Bible toward her as he finished his eggs and bacon. "Rebecca used to read aloud during breakfast. It's a good way to start the day." Miriam felt a brief stab of something, not quite jealousy, but awareness that she was stepping into patterns established by another woman. She opened the Bible to where the ribbon bookmark lay and began reading from Proverbs 31, the passage about the virtuous wife. "She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks," she read, her voice growing more confident as she continued. "She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness." Samuel listened with his eyes closed, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca always said that passage wasn't about perfection," he said finally. "It was about partnership, a woman and man working together to build something that would last beyond their own lives. Is that what you're hoping for? Something that will last?" "Yes," Samuel replied simply. "Legacy. Children who will work this land after we're gone, who will carry on the values we try to live by." After Samuel left for the fields, Miriam spent the morning exploring her new home, more thoroughly than she'd been able to during their brief preparation visits. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and spacious rooms below. Everything was built to last. Solid oak floors, thick plaster walls, windows that fit snugly in their frames. But it was clearly a house that had been maintained by a man living alone. The curtains were functional but plain, the rooms clean but lacking the small touches that made a house feel like a home. Miriam found herself imagining changes, flowers in the windows, colorful quilts on the beds, the sound of children's voices echoing through the empty rooms. The basement held her first. Real challenge. Samuel had mentioned that the root cellar needed organizing before winter set in fully, and when Miriam descended the wooden steps with a lantern, she understood why he'd been avoiding the task. The space was filled with bushel baskets of apples, bins of potatoes and carrots, shelves lined with preserves that dated back 3 years. Much of it was spoiled or past its prime. She spent the day sorting through the accumulated stores, discarding what was no longer good, reorganizing what remained, and making lists of what would need to be replaced. It was dirty, tedious work, but satisfying in its way. By afternoon, the root cellar was clean and efficiently arranged, ready to hold the winter supplies that would keep them fed through the long months ahead. Samuel's reaction when he returned from the fields was worth the effort. He stood in the doorway of the root cellar, lantern in hand, surveying the transformation with obvious approval. "You've accomplished more in one day than I managed in 3 years," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I had motivation," Miriam replied, wiping dirt from her hands. "This is my home now. I want it to function properly." That evening brought their first visit from community members since the wedding. Aaron and Mary Stoltzfus arrived just after supper, bringing fresh milk and obvious curiosity about how the newlyweds were adjusting to married life. "The house looks different already," Mary observed, her eyes taking in the small changes Miriam had made. A vase of dried flowers on the windowsill, cushions arranged more comfortably on the wooden chairs, candles placed where their light would be most welcoming. "Miriam has a gift for making things beautiful," Samuel said, the compliment surprising everyone, including himself. The conversation flowed easily, covering community news and plans for the winter months ahead. But Miriam noticed the way Mary's eyes lingered on certain details, the way Samuel unconsciously moved his chair closer to Miriam's as they talked, how naturally they shared the tasks of serving their guests, the comfortable ease with which they filled each other's silences. "You're settling in well," Aaron said as they prepared to leave. "It's good to see." After their guests departed, Samuel and Miriam found themselves alone in the kitchen, the silence not uncomfortable, but charged with awareness of their new intimacy. They were husband and wife now, sharing a home and a bed, though their physical relationship remained cautious and respectful. "Were you nervous tonight?" Miriam asked as she banked the fire in the stove. "About what?" "Having people see us together as a married couple, wondering if we seemed convincing." Samuel considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "We weren't performing for them. We were just being ourselves, two people learning to live together with kindness and respect. That's more than many married couples manage." That night, as they prepared for bed in their shared bedroom, Miriam felt the strangeness of their situation most acutely. They had been intimate only once since their wedding night, a gentle, careful coming together that had been more about fulfilling their marital obligations than expressing passion. But there had been tenderness in it, and mutual consideration, that spoke well for their future together. "Miriam," Samuel said, as she brushed her hair at the small dressing table he'd moved into the room for her use, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you're doing to make this house a home, for the patience you're showing as we learn to be married." She met his eyes in the mirror, seeing sincerity and something that might have been the beginning of deeper affection. "I'm grateful too," she replied, "for the security you've given me, for the chance to belong somewhere again." "Do you think," Samuel asked hesitantly, "that what we're building could become something more than a practical arrangement?" Miriam turned to face him directly. In the lamplight he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than the composed man who had proposed this marriage with such calm certainty. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're already building something more. Friendship, partnership, trust. Those are the foundations of the best marriages I've known." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Then, we're on the right path." As they settled into bed, maintaining the careful distance they'd established while their relationship deepened, Miriam felt a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced since David's death. This wasn't the passionate romance of her youth, but it was something potentially more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the kind of steady affection that grew stronger with time rather than burning bright and fading fast. Outside, the November wind whistled around the house, but inside they were warm and safe. Two people who had found each other in their grief and were slowly discovering that healing was possible when shared with someone who understood loss. The Bible lay closed on the bedside table, its worn pages holding the wisdom of generations. About love, marriage, and the patience required to build a life together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and small discoveries about each other, but tonight they slept peacefully, husband and wife, partners in a venture that was beginning to feel less like necessity and more like hope. The letters were hidden beneath the false bottom of Samuel's dresser drawer, tied with a faded blue ribbon that had once been the exact color of Rebecca's eyes. Miriam discovered them by accident while looking for extra bedding, her fingers catching on a slight raised edge in the wood that revealed a hidden compartment. She hadn't intended to invade Samuel's privacy, but when she saw her own name written in his careful script on one of the envelopes, curiosity overcame propriety. The letter was dated just a week before their marriage, and what she read made her heart race with emotions she couldn't quite name. "My dearest Rebecca," the letter began, "tomorrow I marry another woman, and I need you to understand why. It isn't because I've forgotten you or because I love you any less. It's because I'm tired of being half alive, tired of this house echoing with emptiness. Miriam is kind and strong, and she needs what I can provide. But she will never have the part of my heart that belongs to you, that died with you and our son, and I will never dishonor your memory by pretending otherwise." The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing Samuel's guilt over their son's death, his fear that he had somehow failed Rebecca by not being able to save her, and his determination never to risk that kind of devastating loss again. The final paragraph made Miriam's hands shake as she read it. "I promise you that this marriage will remain practical, safe. I will care for Miriam as a good husband should, but I will never love her the way I loved you. My heart belongs to you. In this life and whatever comes after, she will be my partner, but you will always be my wife." Miriam sank onto the bed, the letter trembling in her hands. She had known that Samuel still grieved Rebecca deeply, but she hadn't understood the extent to which he was protecting himself and her from the possibility of true intimacy. Their marriage wasn't just practical by necessity, it was practical by his deliberate design. The sound of Samuel's boots on the kitchen floor below sent her scrambling to return the letters to their hiding place. By the time he called up to ask about supper, she had composed herself enough to respond normally, though her mind was reeling with the implications of what she'd discovered. That evening brought an unexpected visit that would change everything. Dr. Harrison Mitchell, the County Social Services Director, arrived just as they were finishing their simple supper. He was a thin, officious man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that he clutched like a shield. "Mr. and Mrs. Beiler," he said, declining their offer of coffee, "I'm here to investigate a complaint filed with our office regarding the circumstances of your recent marriage." Samuel's expression grew carefully neutral, but Miriam could see tension gathering in his shoulders. "What kind of complaint?" "Anonymous sources have suggested that this marriage may not be legitimate, that it was arranged purely for immigration or financial benefit, possibly involving coercion of a vulnerable woman." Dr. Mitchell consulted his notes with bureaucratic precision. "The complaint specifically mentions that Mrs. Beiler was homeless and destitute when the marriage was arranged, raising questions about whether she was truly free to decline." "That's ridiculous," Miriam said, her voice sharper than she intended. "No one coerced me into anything. Nevertheless, we're required to investigate when such complaints are filed," Dr. Mitchell continued. "This will involve interviews with both of you separately, interviews with community members, and a review of the circumstances leading to the marriage. If we determine that the marriage is not legitimate, it could be annulled, and Mrs. Beiler might be required to leave the community." After Dr. Mitchell left with promises to return within the week, Samuel and Miriam sat in stunned silence at their kitchen table. The practical partnership they'd been building suddenly felt fragile, threatened by outside forces that neither understood nor could control. "Who would file such a complaint?" Miriam asked finally. "Could be anyone," Samuel replied grimly. "English neighbors who disapprove of our ways, someone in the community who opposed our marriage from the beginning, even someone with a grudge against me personally. What will happen if they decide our marriage isn't legitimate?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "You'd have to leave," he said finally. "They could force an annulment and you'd be back where you started, homeless, with no legal right to stay in the community." The thought terrified Miriam more than she'd expected. In the weeks since their marriage, she'd begun to think of this house, this community, as truly home. The possibility of losing it all felt like facing another devastating loss just when she'd begun to heal from the last one. "Samuel," she said carefully, "when they interview us separately, they'll ask about our relationship, our feelings for Each other. If we tell them this marriage is purely practical, they'll annul it, Samuel finished grimly. We need to convince them that we're genuinely married, that there's real affection between us. Is there? The question slipped out before Miriam could stop it. Samuel looked at her with surprise, as if the answer should be obvious. Of course there is. Maybe not love in the traditional sense, but respect, caring, genuine fondness. I value you, Miriam, more than I expected when we began this arrangement. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was more than Samuel had ever admitted about his feelings for her. Still, Miriam couldn't shake the memory of his letter to Rebecca, his promise to keep their marriage safely superficial. They'll ask if we love each other, she said quietly. Then we'll tell them yes, Samuel replied without hesitation. Because in our own way, maybe we do. That night, they lay in bed discussing strategy for the interviews, like generals planning a campaign. They would emphasize the genuine affection that had grown between them, the natural partnership they'd developed, the way their lives had become genuinely intertwined. They would downplay the practical circumstances that had brought them together, and instead focus on the relationship they'd built since. There's something else, Miriam said into the darkness. I found your letters to Rebecca. Samuel went very still beside her. I see. I'm sorry for invading your privacy, but I saw my name on one of them, and she stopped, unsure how to continue without sounding accusatory. You read about my promise to her, Samuel said quietly, about keeping my heart safely locked away. Yes. Samuel was silent for so long that Miriam wondered if he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. That letter was written by a man who was afraid to hope for anything more than survival, he said. A man who thought protecting himself from love was more important than opening himself to possibility. And now I'm not sure that man was right. Samuel turned to face her in the darkness, his hand finding hers beneath the quilt. These past weeks, living with you, building this partnership, it's taught me that maybe there are different kinds of love, different ways of caring. For someone, maybe I was wrong to think I could only love one way. Miriam felt tears prick her eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that when they ask if I love my wife, I won't be lying when I say yes. It's not the same love I had for Rebecca, but it's real. It matters, and I'm willing to fight for it. The warmth in his voice, the gentle pressure of his fingers, intertwined with hers, felt like the beginning of something neither had dared to hope for. But even as Miriam's heart lifted with possibility, she couldn't forget the very real threat they faced. If the investigation went badly, if their marriage was declared invalid, she would lose not just the security Samuel had provided, but the friendship and growing affection that had begun to heal her broken heart. And Samuel would be left alone again, his careful walls rebuilt higher than ever. We'll get through this, Samuel said, as if reading her thoughts. Whatever it takes, we'll prove that our marriage is real, even if it means admitting feelings you weren't ready to have. Especially then, Samuel replied firmly, because maybe it's time I stopped being afraid of my own heart. Outside, the November wind howled around their house, but inside they held each other closer than they ever had before, two people discovering that love could indeed take different forms, and that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grew, not from passion, but from the courage to be vulnerable with someone who understood both loss and hope. David's pocket watch lay in Miriam's palm, its silver surface reflecting the lamplight in their bedroom. She'd carried it with her through all the losses and changes of the past months, but tonight it felt like a weight she was finally ready to set down. The watch had stopped working weeks ago, its hands frozen at 3:47, the exact time David had drawn his last breath in the hospital room they'd shared for those final, precious hours. Tomorrow would bring the formal hearing that would determine the validity of her marriage to Samuel. Tonight felt like the end of one chapter of her life and the uncertain beginning of another. You don't have to give it up, Samuel said quietly from where he sat on the edge of their bed, watching as she held the watch up to catch the light. Loving David doesn't diminish what we're building together. I know, Miriam replied, closing her fingers around the smooth metal. But I think I've been holding on to grief so tightly that I haven't left room for anything else to grow. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation and anxiety. Dr. Mitchell had returned twice, conducting separate interviews with both Samuel and Miriam that felt more like interrogations than conversations. He'd questioned every aspect of their relationship, how they'd met, why they'd decided to marry, what their daily lives looked like, whether they shared the same bed, whether they planned to have children together. Most challenging had been his pointed questions about love and affection. "Do you love your husband, Mrs. Beiler?" He'd asked with clinical detachment, as if love were something that could be measured and verified, like income or property ownership. "Yes," she'd answered without hesitation, surprised by how easily the truth came. "I love him." In what way? Romantically, platonically, out of gratitude for his assistance. Miriam had taken a moment to find the right words. "I love him the way a woman loves a man she respects, admires, and wants to build a life with. I love his kindness, his steadiness, his genuine care for others. I love the way he's shown me that it's possible to hope again after loss." Dr. Mitchell had made careful notes, his expression revealing nothing about whether her answers satisfied his concerns. Samuel's interview had been equally thorough. Through the thin walls of the house, Miriam had heard the rumble of their voices, but couldn't make out specific words. When Samuel emerged, his expression was grim but determined. "He asked if I married you out of pity," Samuel had told her afterward. "If I thought of you as a charity case rather than a genuine wife." What did you tell him? The truth. That I married you because you're exactly the kind of woman I wanted as a partner. Strong, intelligent, capable of building something meaningful together. That any man would be fortunate to have you as his wife. The hearing would take place in the county courthouse, with Bishop Lapp and several community members testifying on their behalf. Dr. Mitchell would present his findings to Judge Patricia Hoffman, who would ultimately decide whether their marriage met legal standards or should be annulled. The community had rallied around them with surprising force. Martha Lapp had organized a letter-writing campaign, gathering testimonials from every family in Cedar Valley about Miriam's character and the genuine nature of her relationship with Samuel. Aaron Stoltzfus had volunteered to testify about the practical wisdom of their arrangement and how well they worked together as partners. Even the children from the schoolhouse had asked if they could write letters supporting Teacher Miriam, as they'd begun calling her. "I've never seen the community unite like this," Bishop Lapp had told them during his visit the previous evening. "Whatever the original concerns about your marriage, people have seen how you've grown together. They're fighting for you because they believe in what you've built. But support from the community wouldn't matter if the judge decided their marriage lacked the emotional foundation that law required." Samuel and Miriam had spent hours discussing their testimony, trying to find ways to express the depth of their partnership without appearing rehearsed or artificial. "Tell me something," Samuel said now, settling more comfortably on the bed beside her. "When did you first realize you might actually love me? Not just care for me or appreciate what I'd offered, but genuinely love me?" Miriam considered the question carefully. "The day you showed me Rebecca's unfinished quilt and trusted me to complete it. You could have kept that private, could have put it away where I'd never see it. Instead, you shared something precious and painful, and you trusted me to honor it properly. And when did you realize I might love you? 2 nights ago, when you told Dr. Mitchell that any man would be fortunate to have me as his wife. You weren't saying what you thought he wanted to hear. You meant it. I could see it in your eyes." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hand finding hers. "I did mean it. I do mean it. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about practical necessity and became about wanting to build a real life with you, even knowing we might not have the chance, especially knowing that." Samuel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Losing Rebecca taught me how precious love is, how quickly it can be taken away. I won't waste the opportunity to love you properly, whatever time we're given." The next morning dawned grey and cold, with the kind of penetrating chill that spoke of winter's final approach. Miriam dressed carefully in her best Amish clothing, the dark blue dress that had been made for her wedding, the black shoes that marked her married status, the white prayer covering that had become as natural as breathing. Samuel wore his finest black suit, the one reserved for the most solemn occasions. As they prepared to leave for the courthouse, he paused to take her hands in his. "Whatever happens today," he said, his brown eyes serious but warm, "I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I've made since Rebecca died. You've given me back hope, purpose, the possibility of a family. That matters more than any legal document. And if we lose, then we'll find another way. I won't let bureaucrats destroy what we've built together." The drive to the courthouse took them through Lancaster's busy streets, so different from the quiet farmland they'd come to think of as home. Modern buildings, traffic lights, and the constant hum of contemporary life felt alien after weeks of living by the rhythms of sunrise and sunset, seasons and weather. Bishop Lapp met them at the courthouse steps, along with Aaron and Mary Stoltzfus, Martha Lapp, and Anna from the schoolhouse. Their presence was both comforting and sobering, a reminder of how much they stood to lose if the hearing went badly. "Remember," Bishop Lapp said quietly as they entered the imposing building, "speak from your hearts. The truth of your relationship will be evident to anyone who listens with wisdom." The courtroom was smaller than Miriam had expected, panelled in dark wood, and filled with the kind of formal solemnity that made every sound seem amplified. Judge Hoffman was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the case files with careful attention before calling the hearing to order. Dr. Mitchell presented his investigation first, outlining the circumstances that had led to the marriage and the concerns that had prompted the inquiry. His tone was professional, but skeptical, focusing on the practical benefits Samuel had gained from the arrangement and the vulnerable position Miriam had been in when she agreed to it. "The respondents claim their marriage is based on genuine affection," he concluded, "but the evidence suggests it was primarily a transaction, shelter and security in exchange for household management and the promise of children." Judge Hoffman listened without expression, making occasional notes. When Dr. Mitchell finished, she turned her attention to Bishop Lapp, who had requested permission to testify on behalf of the couple. "Your Honor," Bishop Lapp began, his accented English clear and dignified, "I have served this community as bishop for over 20 years. In that time, I have officiated at dozens of marriages and counseled many couples through difficulties. I can say with certainty that what Samuel and Miriam Beiler have built together is as real and valid as any marriage I have blessed." He went on to describe their integration into community life, the respect they'd earned from their neighbors, and the obvious affection that had developed between them. "Marriage in our community is indeed practical," he admitted, "but it is also sacred. We would not have blessed this union if we did not believe it was grounded in genuine care and commitment." Martha Lapp testified about Miriam's character and the changes she'd observed in Samuel since the marriage. "He's become himself again," she said simply. The grief that had consumed him for 3 years began to lift the moment Miriam became part of his life. Aaron Stoltzfus spoke about their work partnership and the way they naturally complemented each other's strengths. Anna described Miriam's gift with the school children and how naturally she'd assumed the role of community teacher and mentor. But it was the final testimony that carried the most weight. Judge Hoffman called Samuel and Miriam forward together, asking them to speak not as separate individuals, but as a married couple. "Tell me," the judge said, her sharp eyes moving between them, "why your marriage deserves legal recognition. Not why it's convenient or practical, but why it matters." Samuel and Miriam looked at each other, a moment of silent communication passing between them. They had rehearsed individual answers, but this question demanded something more, spontaneous, more authentic. Samuel spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. "Your Honor, when I married Miriam, I thought I was offering charity to a woman in need. What I discovered was that she was offering me something far more valuable, the chance to live fully again after grief had left me half alive. She didn't just accept my proposal, she transformed it into something beautiful." Miriam took a breath, finding her own words. "I married Samuel thinking I was accepting refuge from circumstances beyond my control. What I found was a partner who saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself, who gave me not just security, but purpose, community, and the hope of a future I'd thought was impossible." "And now," Judge Hoffman asked, "what is your marriage now?" They answered together, their voices overlapping naturally. "Home." The simple word hung in the courtroom air, carrying with it all the weight of shared meals and quiet conversations, of learning to work together and sleep peacefully side by side, of building something new from the pieces of what they'd lost. Judge Hoffman was quiet for a long moment, reviewing her notes one final time. The silence stretched until Miriam could hear her own heartbeat, until the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. "I'll render my decision after a brief recess," the judge said finally. "Please remain available." As they waited in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by their community supporters, Miriam realized that regardless of the legal outcome, something fundamental had already been decided. She and Samuel had stopped pretending their marriage was merely practical. They had admitted to themselves and to a room full of strangers that they had built something real together. David's pocket watch felt lighter in her pocket, its silent hands no longer marking time that had stopped, but pointing toward a future that was finally ready to begin. The testimony book lay open on Judge Hoffman's desk, its pages filled with handwritten statements from nearly every family in Cedar Valley. Martha Lapp had spent 3 days collecting the testimonies, visiting each household to gather written proof of what she already knew, that Samuel and Miriam Beiler's marriage had become the foundation for genuine partnership and growing love. Judge Hoffman read through the statements methodically, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Behind her, the afternoon sun slanted through tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the formal courtroom where their future would be decided. "Mr. and Mrs. Beiler," the judge said finally, looking up from the collection of testimonies. "These statements paint a picture of two people who have found genuine partnership in an unconventional arrangement. But I still have concerns about the circumstances that led to your marriage." Miriam felt Samuel's hand find hers beneath the table where they sat with their community representatives. His touch was steady, grounding, but she could feel the tension in his fingers. "Mrs. Beiler," Judge Hoffman continued, "you were essentially homeless when this marriage was proposed. In such circumstances, how can anyone determine whether your consent was truly free? Desperation can make choices seem voluntary when they're actually coercive." The question cut to the heart of Miriam's deepest fears about their arrangement. Had she married Samuel out of genuine attraction to the partnership he offered, or simply because she'd had no other options? "Your Honor," Miriam said, rising slightly in her chair, "I won't pretend that my circumstances weren't desperate. They were. But desperation doesn't negate the ability to make wise choices. Sometimes it clarifies what really matters." She paused, gathering her thoughts, aware that her next words might determine their fate. "When Samuel proposed, I could have accepted out of pure gratitude and dependency. Instead, I took time to consider whether I could genuinely contribute to building a life together. I asked myself whether I respected him enough to commit to partnership, whether I could learn to love the life he was offering. The answer to both questions was yes." Judge Hoffman made notes, her expression thoughtful. "And Mr. Beiler, these testimonies suggest that you were profoundly grieving when you made this proposal. Some might argue that grief impaired your judgment, that you were seeking to fill a void rather than forge a genuine relationship. Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Grief did influence my decision, Your Honor, but not in the way you suggest. Losing Rebecca taught me how precious partnership is, how quickly it can be taken away. When I met Miriam, I recognized something in her: strength, kindness, the capacity for building something meaningful from difficult circumstances. I wasn't trying to replace what I'd lost. I was trying to create something new. These community statements are compelling, Judge Hoffman admitted, gesturing to the testimony book. They describe a couple who work well together, who've integrated successfully into community life, who showed genuine affection for each other. But legal marriage requires more than successful partnership. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward in his chair, his earlier skepticism evident in his posture. Your Honor, if we validate marriages based solely on practical benefits and community approval, we set a dangerous precedent. Marriage fraud often involves exactly these elements: couples who appear committed publicly while maintaining purely transactional relationships privately. That's exactly why I want to hear more about the private aspects of this relationship, Judge Hoffman said, turning back to Samuel and Miriam. Dr. Mitchell's investigation suggests your marriage began as a practical arrangement. How do you respond to concerns that it remains primarily transactional? Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding that the judge was asking about intimate aspects of their relationship that felt too private to discuss in open court. But their marriage's validity depended on proving its authenticity in every dimension. Our relationship has evolved significantly since our wedding, she said carefully. What began as mutual respect and shared goals has grown into genuine affection. In partnership, we share not just household responsibilities, but hopes, concerns, daily joys and struggles. We've become friends and confidants as well as husband and wife. Can you be more specific about the nature of your relationship? Samuel intervened, his voice firm but respectful. Your Honor, we share a marriage bed. We're hoping for children together, and we've built the kind of intimacy that comes from truly knowing and caring for another person. Our relationship encompasses all aspects of marriage: emotional, physical, spiritual, and practical. Judge Hoffman nodded, making more notes. I appreciate your directness. Now, regarding the complainant, who initiated this investigation, do either of you know who filed the original report? Samuel and Miriam exchanged glances. They'd speculated endlessly about the identity of their anonymous accuser, but had never reached any certainties. We don't know for certain, Samuel admitted, but we suspect it may have been someone who disapproved of our marriage from the beginning, either from within our community or from among our English neighbors. The complaint specifically mentioned concerns about Mrs. Beiler's vulnerability and the practical benefits Mr. Beiler gained from the arrangement, Dr. Mitchell added. Whoever filed it had detailed knowledge of the circumstances leading to the marriage, which suggests someone who was present at our community meeting or heard detailed accounts from those who attended, Miriam said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. Someone who chose to question our marriage's validity, rather than simply accepting that two adults made a mutual decision to build a life together. Judge Hoffman closed the testimony book and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I've heard compelling arguments on both sides. The practical circumstances that led to your marriage do raise legitimate questions about free consent and genuine affection. However, the evidence of your relationship's development since the wedding suggests that whatever the original motivations, you've built something authentic together. The silence in the courtroom stretched taut as everyone waited for her next words. I'm going to take a 15-minute recess to review all the evidence before rendering my decision, Judge Hoffman announced. This case hinges on whether a marriage that began for practical reasons can be considered legally valid if it has evolved into genuine partnership and affection. As the judge left the courtroom, Miriam felt the weight of uncertainty settle over her like a heavy blanket. Everything they'd built together, their home, their partnership, their growing love, hung in the balance of one woman's interpretation of what constituted a valid marriage. Samuel squeezed her hand tighter, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens, we know the truth about what we've created together." The new quilt pattern lay sketched on paper in Miriam's lap as they waited for Judge Hoffman to return. Interlocking rings in shades of blue and gold, a design that had come to her during the long, anxious hours of testimony. She'd started drawing it unconsciously, her hands needing something to do, while her mind wrestled with the possibility of losing everything they'd built together. "What are you working on?" Samuel asked quietly, glancing at the sketch. "A pattern for our quilt," she replied, then caught herself. "I mean, a quilt I hope we'll be able to make together." Samuel studied the design, recognizing the symbolism immediately. Rings that connected and supported each other, creating something beautiful from individual elements. "It's perfect," he said softly, "whether we're allowed to make it together or apart. It represents what we've learned about love and partnership." The courtroom door opened and Judge Hoffman returned to her bench with a thick folder of notes and documents. Her expression was neutral, professional, giving no hint of her decision. The small group of supporters from Cedar Valley straightened in their seats, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. "I've carefully reviewed all testimony and evidence presented today," Judge Hoffman began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "This case has forced me to consider fundamental questions about the nature of marriage, consent, and the evolution of human relationships." Miriam found herself holding her breath, David's pocket watch heavy in her dress pocket, Samuel's hand warm and steady in hers. The complainant raised legitimate concerns about the circumstances leading to this marriage, the judge continued. "Mrs. Beiler was indeed in desperate circumstances when the arrangement was proposed, and Mr. Beiler did gain significant practical benefits from the union. These facts cannot be dismissed or minimized." Dr. Mitchell straightened in his chair, clearly expecting vindication of his investigation's concerns. "However," Judge Hoffman continued, "the evidence also shows that both parties entered this marriage with full knowledge of its practical nature, with genuine respect for each other, and with sincere intentions to build a meaningful partnership. More importantly, the testimony demonstrates that their relationship has evolved far beyond its original parameters." The judge paused, looking directly at Samuel and Miriam. "The community statements paint a picture of two people who have found genuine companionship, mutual support, and growing affection. Your own testimony today revealed individuals who have moved from practical arrangement to emotional commitment, who have chosen to love each other despite, or perhaps because of, the unconventional beginning of their relationship." Miriam felt tears prick her eyes, hope beginning to unfurl in her chest like a flower opening to sunlight. "Marriage takes many forms," Judge Hoffman continued. "Arranged marriages that develop into deep love, passionate romances that grow into steady partnership, practical unions that discover unexpected emotional depth. The law doesn't require marriage to begin with love, only that it be entered freely and maintained with commitment and respect." The judge consulted her notes one final time before delivering her verdict. "Based on the evidence presented, I find that Samuel and Miriam Beiler's marriage was entered into freely by two consenting adults who understood the nature of their commitment. While the arrangement was indeed practical in origin, it has evolved into a relationship that meets all legal and moral standards for marriage. The petition for annulment is denied." The words hit Miriam like a wave of relief so powerful it left her momentarily dizzy. Samuel's hand tightened around hers, and she could see the tension leave his shoulders as their supporters from Cedar Valley quietly celebrated behind them. "Furthermore," Judge Hoffman added, "I want to address the nature of the complaint that initiated this investigation. Anonymous accusations about marriage validity are serious matters that require careful consideration. However, I hope that whoever filed this complaint will recognize that they witnessed not marriage fraud, but the beautiful evolution of a practical partnership into genuine love." Dr. Mitchell rose from his seat, his professional demeanor intact, despite the ruling against his recommendation. "Your Honor, while I respect your decision, I maintain that the original circumstances warranted investigation." "Absolutely," Judge Hoffman agreed. "Your investigation was thorough and appropriate. But sometimes investigations reveal not wrongdoing, but rather the remarkable capacity of human hearts to find love in unexpected places." As the formal proceedings concluded, Miriam found herself surrounded by the community members who had traveled to support them. Martha Lapp embraced her with tears in her eyes, while Bishop Lapp shook Samuel's hand with quiet satisfaction. "You fought for each other," Aaron Stoltzfus observed with approval. "That's what good marriages do. They fight for themselves." Outside the courthouse, the November afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that spoke of winter's approach, but promised that spring would follow in its time. As they prepared for the journey home to Cedar Valley, Miriam pulled David's pocket watch from her pocket one final time. "I think," she said to Samuel, "it's time to let this go." She walked to a nearby bench where an elderly man sat feeding pigeons, his weathered hands and gentle manner reminding her somehow of David in his later years. "Excuse me," she said, "would you like to have this? It belonged to my first husband, and I think he'd be glad to know it was helping someone keep track of precious time." The old man accepted the watch with surprise and gratitude, winding it carefully and watching as its hands began moving again, marking new moments instead of preserving old ones. Samuel was waiting beside their buggy when she returned, his expression warm with understanding and something deeper, something that looked very much like love. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Beiler?" he asked, offering his hand to help her into the buggy. "Yes," she replied, taking his hand and looking into the brown eyes that had become as familiar and dear as her own heartbeat. "I'm ready to go home." As they drove through the Pennsylvania countryside towards Cedar Valley, past the rolling fields and simple farmhouses that had become their world, Miriam realized that she was no longer a woman seeking refuge from loss. She was a wife returning home with her husband, a member of a community that had fought to protect what they'd built together. The quilt pattern in her lap would become reality, she knew. Rings of blue and gold stitched together with patience, and love, covering children not yet born, but already hoped for, warming a family that had been created not from passion, but from the deeper foundation of choice, commitment, and the daily decision to love well. 6 months after the courthouse hearing, Miriam stood in her kitchen, kneading bread dough, while tiny baby shoes, knitted in soft yellow wool, dried on the windowsill above the sink. The shoes were no bigger than her palm, crafted during the long winter evenings when she and Samuel sat by the fire, she with her knitting needles and he with farm ledgers or a book of scripture. The baby wasn't due until late summer, but Miriam had started preparing early, driven by the kind of nesting instinct that came with carrying a long-awaited child. Each tiny garment she completed felt like a promise kept, a hope fulfilled, a tangible sign that their practical marriage had indeed blossomed into something extraordinary. "The bread smells wonderful," Samuel said, entering the kitchen from his morning barn chores with color in his cheeks from the May sunshine and the satisfaction of work well done. He paused behind her chair to drop a gentle kiss on the top of her head, a gesture that had become natural over the months of their deepening partnership. "Martha Lapp's recipe," Miriam replied, leaning back against his warmth for a moment before returning to her kneading. "She says it's what Rebecca used to make, and you always spoke highly of her bread." There had been a time when mentioning Rebecca would have brought awkwardness, but now Samuel's first wife was simply part of their family history, honored, remembered, but no longer a barrier to their own growing love. The unfinished quilt had been completed and now covered their marriage bed, its intricate rings a testament to the way different kinds of love could coexist and complement each other. Rebecca's bread was good, Samuel acknowledged, wrapping his arms around Miriam's expanding waist. "But yours is better. Everything about our life together is better than I dared to hope when I first made that proposal." The transformation in Samuel over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The carefully guarded man who had offered her a practical arrangement had opened his heart gradually, like a flower turning towards sunlight. He laughed more easily now, shared his thoughts and concerns freely, and spoke about the future with genuine excitement rather than dutiful planning. "The community meeting is tonight," Miriam reminded him as she shaped the dough into loaves. "Bishop Lapp wants to discuss the plans for expanding the schoolhouse, and to formally acknowledge your role as head teacher," Samuel added with pride. "Anna says the children have never been more engaged with their lessons." It was true. Miriam's background in education had proven invaluable to the settlement's one-room school. She'd introduced new teaching methods that honored Amish traditions while helping the children excel in their studies. More importantly, she'd found deep satisfaction in nurturing young minds and watching them grow in confidence and capability. The afternoon brought a stream of visitors, as had become common since word spread about Miriam's pregnancy. In Amish communities, expecting mothers were cherished and supported by the entire settlement, with women taking turns bringing meals, offering advice, and helping with household tasks as the pregnancy progressed. Sarah King arrived first, carrying a basket of fresh eggs and early spring vegetables from her garden. "You're blooming like a spring flower," she declared with satisfaction, studying Miriam's glowing complexion and the gentle roundness that was just beginning to show beneath her apron. Mary Stoltzfus followed with fabric for baby blankets, and soon the kitchen was filled with women's voices discussing everything from morning sickness remedies to the best techniques for managing household duties with a newborn. Their acceptance of Miriam had evolved from polite tolerance to genuine affection, and now they treated her pregnancy as a community celebration. "This baby will be so loved," Martha Lapp observed, watching as the women pooled their collective wisdom about childcare and family management. Growing up surrounded by so many people who already care deeply about his or her welfare. That evening's community meeting proved to be more celebration than business. Bishop Lapp formally recognized Miriam's contributions to the school, but most of the conversation centered on plans for a community barn raising to expand Samuel's dairy operation. Their success as a farming partnership had been so evident that several neighbors were eager to help them prepare for the larger operation that would be needed to support a growing family. "Samuel's farm is producing better than it has in years," Aaron Stoltzfus noted with approval. "Having a partner who understands both the work and the business side has made all the difference." As they walked home through the gathering dusk, past fields green with spring crops and farmhouses glowing with lamplight, Samuel and Miriam moved with the comfortable rhythm of two people whose lives had become genuinely intertwined. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't made that proposal?" Samuel asked as they paused to admire the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Sometimes," Miriam admitted, "but not with regret. I think we found each other exactly when we needed to, in exactly the way we needed to. Even though it wasn't romantic, even though we came together out of necessity rather than passion." Miriam turned to face her husband fully, taking in the dear, familiar features that had become as essential to her happiness as breathing. "Especially because of that," she said firmly. "We built this love deliberately, with full knowledge of what we were choosing. That makes it precious in a way that accidental love can never be." Samuel's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. With the easy intimacy of a couple who had learned to communicate as much through touch as through words. "When this baby is born," he said quietly, "he or she will be surrounded by love that was chosen, nurtured, and protected. That seems like the best possible foundation for a new life." As they reached their house, their home, Miriam could see the lamplight glowing in windows that now reflected not just shelter, but belonging, partnership, and the deep satisfaction that came from building something beautiful together from the ashes of loss. The baby shoes on the kitchen windowsill caught the last rays of sunlight, casting tiny shadows that looked like promises of laughter, first steps, and bedtime stories yet to come. In the months ahead, those shoes would be filled by small feet that belonged to a child conceived not just in love, but in the profound hope that had grown from two broken hearts learning to beat in harmony. Sometimes, Miriam reflected, as she and Samuel settled into their evening routine of shared chores and quiet conversation, the most beautiful love stories weren't about finding your missing piece, but about two complete people choosing to create something new together, something stronger and more resilient than either could have built alone. The worn gold band on her finger caught the lamplight as she moved around the kitchen, but now it shared space with Samuel's simple wedding ring, two circles of commitment that honored both the past that had shaped them and the future they were creating together, one chosen day at a time.